I like to remind people that you are who you are, and nothing that happens today or tomorrow is going to change that, right?
Yeah.
So whether you get fired, whether you succeed or you fail, you've always been that person.
You're listening to the Elevate podcast, and I'm your host, Robert Glazer. Join me as I talk to world-class performers about how they build their capacity and reach greater heights in leadership, business, and life, and how you can do the same.
Welcome to the Elevate podcast. Our quote for today is from David Bach. In fact, what determines your wealth is not how much you make, but how much you keep of what you make. My guest today, Jordan Grumet, also known as Dr. G, is a physician turned financial expert and author who brings a unique perspective on wealth, purpose, and legacy. A former hospice doctor, his exposure to the reflections of people at the end of their lives prompted him to pivot into the world of personal finance, where he helps people align their financial decisions with their life purpose. Jordan is the author of the acclaimed book, Taking Stock, The Purpose Code, and publishes a popular blog on finance and fulfillment, and hosts the Earn and Invest podcast. Jordan, thanks for joining me today on the Elevate podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
So I always like to start at the beginning, maybe ask about childhood. Your case, it's like two different tracks. So I'm going to say, like, what was growing up like for you, and what was both your understanding of maybe money and personal finance and debt that led you down this interesting career shift?
So when I was 7 years old, my father died suddenly and unexpectedly. He had a brain aneurysm. He was actually rounding in the hospital because he was a physician, got a severe headache, collapsed, and died. And so that colored my vision of career, money, and purpose. It really changed everything because at 7 years old, I very much looked at the world through my own self-centered lens, as most 7-year-olds do. So I figured, well, he died, and that had something to do with me. I wasn't good enough. I didn't behave well enough. I had done something wrong. So the answer eventually became, if I could just become a doctor like him, I would cosmically solve all these problems. I could walk in his footsteps. I could carry on the good work he was doing. And that's what I did. So I had no interest in money. Money was not interesting to me at all.
Did money get tight or problematic after he passed away, or no?
So a few things happened, which were lucky. So my mother was a stay-at-home mom, but she had a deep history of being in scientific fields. She actually was a teacher at one point, decided she wanted to go to business school. So she was about to graduate from business school with a CPA when my father died. And so she got offered a job at the place she was interning at. So she had a job, which was great. My dad did have some life insurance, strange story. So he had one life insurance policy for $200,000. And then he had another life insurance policy from his work. He had just started in a new private practice, and they were supposed to get him $1 million policy, and they forgot. And so he died, and this $1 million policy that was promised never showed up. And my mom was just too emotionally exhausted to sue them or deal with them. So she worked and had very much of a scarcity mindset. Her thought was, we grew up thinking, and my mom thought that she was going to have to sell the house to put us through college, and she was going to, live her last days in some small apartment somewhere with nothing. Now, that $200,000 from my dad's life insurance policy went directly into investments. This was in the 1980s. If you remember, bonds were paying like 15%. She ended up investing it very wisely. That money paid for all of our college education. So 3 boys' college educations. It paid for all of my medical school. It paid for my brother's graduate school. And there was still some money left over after. So we were
a lot of times
lucky.
It takes some work to figure out the dotted line between someone's formative experiences and their professional interests. Yours is not that complicated.
Yeah. I think I was born to at least do what I did. Now, as an adult, when I eventually burned out, I realized that maybe this was not necessarily the right path for me, but it was the path I took nonetheless.
All right. So you went down the medical profession, worked with a lot. What kind of, you worked with hospice patients?
So I started in general internal medicine. And so I basically was a doctor who took care of adults in the hospital, in the nursing home, in the office, sometimes even in people's homes, but I didn't do any surgical procedures. So as a general doctor, But as I was building my career, and especially as I started getting tired of practicing medicine and realizing that I needed enough money to leave, I started doing what I call medical side hustles, and hospice was one of those. There were hospices that were looking for doctors. There was a shortage of doctors who knew how to practice hospice medicine, and I was already taking care of elderly people, often people at the end of life anyway. And so I did a side hustle as a medical director for one of these hospices, and that eventually became the thing I liked most about medicine.
And so what was your sort of, look, you read a lot of articles of people who work with people at the end of their life. What was some of the biggest takeaways you had from the discussion, and then ultimately sort of leading you to decide to completely change careers?
Well, actually, there are two major inflection points. One has to do with hospice patients and one doesn't. Back when I was in the midst of my career, I started writing about medicine. Writing actually was something much more aligned with my purpose. I eventually would find more than being a doctor. And I was writing a medical blog, and I got a phone call from this guy named Jim Dolly. He wrote a book called The White Coat Investor. It was all about investing and finances for doctors. And he sent me his book to review for my medical blog. And I did. And it taught me all about personal finance. And I realized that I was probably financially independent and didn't need to work anymore. So that sent me down the rabbit hole of learning about personal finances, eventually a blog and a podcast. But the thing was, on my podcast, I was interviewing entrepreneurs, financial independence people, authors, and I found that we often got stuck on not how do you make money, how do you build a business or career. That was something they were really great at answering. But what they weren't so great at answering is a little bit of the why and what comes next. And strangely enough, I was starting to get the answers to those questions from my hospice patients, because I would sit with them at their bedside at the end of life, and we'd have all these conversations about their lives, and they wouldn't talk about money, and they wouldn't talk about work, and they wouldn't talk about working on the weekends. Really what they would talk about was regrets. What did they always regret never having the energy, courage, or time to do? So everyone's regrets were different depending on who they were, but it was the same theme. Like there were these
I've heard
important
this
things in
over
my
and
life.
over again from people in hospice. It's all things that they didn't do, didn't try, person they didn't ask out, job they didn't took, business they didn't start.
Yeah.
Right?
And think about this. How magical is this? In the dying, regrets are all about disappointment because you don't have time or energy or agency. But if you were not dying, and specifically if you were young, regret is actually another word for purpose. And so it's kind of amazing. You can flip that around and say, well, if I could foresee that I'm going to regret this on my deathbed, the onus is on me now to start turning that into a version of purpose.
Now, let me ask you, well, I'm curious too about what about in the finance for a white coat, like what is it about the finance stuff that was particular to doctors in that? What was it about that advice?
So strangely enough, it wasn't particularly for doctors. He actually talks about high net worth individuals or high income individuals.
Okay.
So a lot of the advice would work for anyone, but there were some things that were very doctor oriented. So for instance, one of his big sayings is live like a resident. So if you are a physician during residency, you get paid very little. And then you finish residency and you start practicing and your pay bumps up like 5, 6, 7 times.
And your spending does too.
Well, your spending can. So one of his big pieces of advice is, hey, for 3 or 4 years, just keep living like a resident. So of course, the same thing would occur like if you are a business student and you're getting your MBA and then all of a sudden you get a high paying job, live like you're a business student. So most of the advice translates over, but there's some medical terms specifically. And one of the reasons that book was so important to me is it just gave me the vocabulary to really understand my finances.
So let's talk about why did they not do these things? I'm curious. Was it that they were scared, or was there a financial component of not being able to take risk? Obviously, I never asked the high school sweetheart out or whatever, that's not a financial thing. But I assume a lot of the risks that they couldn't take were because they didn't have basic financial security. Is that right?
I think the reason why people end up with regrets, there are probably 3 main reasons. 1 is societal expectation.
Yeah.
2 is ultimately fear. And then last is the perceived lack of time or money. So let's talk about each of them. Societal expectation. Look, when we are kids, we naturally have a sense of purpose and we have things we love doing. I mean, look at a kid's room. There are trophies all over the place. There are posters, there are drawings. But as you get older, you kind of become inculcated to this idea that adults work on careers and we do things to make money. And those are often not the same things we did that brought us joy during childhood. So we abandon a lot of those earlier versions of purpose and joy. And society is really good at telling us what we should be doing. I mean, look at social media or look at marketing.
Yeah.
It's trying to sell us the six-pack abs and the travel to exotic places and the really nice clothes. And of course, they're trying to sell us something. So they're trying to sell that purpose to us so that we'll buy their
And
products.
society has also sold a lot of people on, look, just do whatever you do to make money, and eventually at 65, you'll start enjoying life, which I thought that, when I first read Tim Ferriss's book, The 4 Hour Work Week, I thought it was a very misunderstood book about productivity. I thought that was a philosophical book, and I took a lot out of like, wow, I might not even be here at 65. Like, that seems like a silly plan, right?
And the idea is to take your finances and use them to build a framework in which you can live a much more purposeful life. And so what we've done is a lot of us have done what I think was the second problem is we kind of are afraid to really look inside and think what's really deeply important to us, because by recognizing that, we're kind of saying life is finite, and if we don't work on it now, we may never. So instead, we use money or career as a mirage to avoid doing the hard work. And so that was that kind of second thing I talked about. The first was societal. The second was kind of that fear of failure, the fear of just dealing with the fact that life is finite. And I think the third thing is then the lack of perceived money and time. And so people really put things off because like, I don't have enough money. I have to work on my career to make lots of money, or I don't have enough time. The time one is pretty easy to dispel. I mean, the Bureau of Labor has done the U.S. time survey for decades and found that your average American has 5 to 6 hours of free time a day, and that even poor people tend to have slightly more time than more wealthy people. And so I don't think
I don't have time. I'm busy. Anyone I know who's worked with a really good leadership coach, one of the things they do, and I'm sure you've done this, is the calendar audit.
Yeah.
And it's pretty telling. Like, because you go to someone, do you know you spent like 15 hours this month looking at people's food on Facebook? Like, is that valuable part of your life? So I get that people are busy, but I think people are very inaccurate how they, I know how much time I waste if I really want to get into it.
People are just as inaccurate with money. And so this argument, I don't have enough money. And so we forget that money is just one of many tools. It's a very powerful tool to do the things we want to do. But we also have our youth, our energy, our communities, our skills, our passions, our families. We have all these other tools. And so if you're lacking in money, it really becomes a question of, can you utilize and leverage some of those other tools to start doing things that are important to you?
So rewinding for a sec, like, what is your definition of purpose? I think people get stressed out by thinking about having to figure out their purpose.
Let me give you a general definition and then some details. So purpose is pretty much the why of what we do. But I think people really confuse it with meaning and happiness. So I often say that happiness is meaning and purpose. Meaning has to do with our past. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, and it's very cognitive. Whereas purpose is about our present and future, and is very action oriented. So it's the things we do today and in the future to fill us up.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You said fill us up. When people talk about their kids, I had a person on the podcast a few months ago, Dr. Shivani, who's kind of world-renowned parenting expert, and she's like, she sort of debunked the quote, "You're only as happy as your youngest kid." She's like, my kid's never happy. Like, I'm not going to make myself miserable. But if you ask everyone, I just want my kids to be happy. You can't be happy all the time. There's a lot of stuff that goes on. I think the goal should really be fulfillment, right? That on net, it's something fulfilling. It doesn't mean I don't have bad times or unhappy, like, because you can't be happy all the time. And I think the expectation that you can is what's ironically creating a lot of depression.
I think that's true. And this idea that our kids are our happiness or fulfillment too, I also think is a little bit off center. This idea that our kids are our purpose, I don't think that's necessarily healthy.
It's very self-centered, right?
Yeah. And not only that, but you want to model for your kids behavior in which they grew up to live these big, fulfilling lives themselves. So if you're modeling that they are the most important thing in your life, well, those kids are going to grow up and think their kids have to be the most important thing in their life. But what if they don't get married or have kids? Or
and this is the thing, fulfillment just looks different for everyone. I think for a lot of people, following the path, going to the good school, getting the job, becoming the surgeon, to everyone else, it looks great and they're miserable. They just want to be in a cabin writing books in the woods, right? That's just not fulfilling to them. It's other people's definition of success. And so, I like the Abe Lincoln, just whatever you are, be a good one. I always joke with my kids. I'm like, you can find someone and they're like the grasshopper expert in the world, right? And they're being invited to grasshopper conventions and they're writing books about grasshoppers.
They've got a
and they're
grasshopper community.
Go-to person on
community.
grasshoppers. Yeah. And like, they're pretty happy. Like, it's just be really good at whatever it is, right?
I think we've got confused with the words.
Yeah.
And I think when you get rid of all these big, complicated words out of the way, it really comes out to what is winning the game. And so in my opinion, here's what winning the game is. From the day we're born to the day we die, we have a set amount of time and we have no idea how much that is because we don't know how long we're going to live, right?
Yeah.
And time passes no matter what you do. People say you can buy time, you can sell time, or trade time. That's bullshit. Time just passes. There's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
The one thing you have a slight bit of control over is what activities you are doing while time passes. So here's winning the game. Winning the game is getting rid of as many things you loathe and putting in as many purposeful, deeply fulfilling things as possible into those time slots, however many you have. And so from the day we're born until the day we die, a productive person is constantly modifying. They are using their tools like their finances and like their community and their passions and their joys and their time and their energy and their youth. They're using all those tools to continuously get rid of things they loathe and continuously fill that time with things that just give them pleasure and joy. And this gets into my book, The Purpose Code. Really, we're talking about what I call little p purpose. This is stuff you love the process of doing regardless of the end goal. It's not big. It's not audacious. It's not being a billionaire. It's not becoming president. It's what brings you to a state of flow. Like, what do you do that just fills you so much up that you lose track of time? We want as much of that in our life.
It's interesting. Like, one that like comes up for a lot is like gardening, right? They just have like, they're out there for hours and doing it and it's enjoyable. And then they look the next day. And this is why I wrote in a Friday Forward last month. I think we need to get back to more physical tasks and manual, sometimes just like fixing the signpost or painting the door. Like you then come home and you're like, oh, I did that. Like, there's some fulfillment in that.
Yeah. And I think, so the Harvard developmental health study, the one that started like in the 1920s, covered thousands of people. Literally, they interviewed people every 2 years. They eventually did MRIs, EEGs, blood tests. And after like 80 years of study, they found that the closest approximation to happiness had nothing to do with money, had nothing to do with career. It had to do with interpersonal connections. And I think this gets back to what you're talking about. When you're out building the sign, first of all, you're building the sign for someone, whether that's you or other people. And people stop by and they help you and you collaborate. When you do the things that kind of fill you up, you tend to attract people to you. And that's the beginning of community, which I think also is probably really strongly related to happiness. Purpose is a conduit or a vector to community. I don't think purpose actually on its own fills us up. I think it helps us create community and connections. And I think that goes back to the Harvard study of what happiness really looks like.
Yeah, and there's an interesting intersection. These things are inextricably intertwined between physical health, financial health, and living a purpose-driven life. And I think as you get older, and I have a lot of friends now who are getting very serious as they approach 50 around, physical, both cardio and strength, and just understanding that like the baseline is going to get worse from here. And so I need to keep it as high as I can. And one thing I've noticed, you start getting hurt a lot more as you get older.
Yes.
And when whatever it is, like even like your elbow, your leg or whatever, like it just becomes the only thing you can focus on when something's not working. And it just gets in the way of all these other things. And you can see that why it's so important, because it's just, you like never noticed your right elbow until you realize that like it's sore and everything you do needs your right elbow.
I think it's a virtuous cycle. I mean, studies show that pursuing a sense of purpose in life causes increased longevity, health, and happiness.
Yeah.
Increased longevity, health, and happiness give you more energy, make you more likely to get up and use that body and be active and physical. I think one leads to the other, and I think they're definitely intimately connected.
I'm jump around a little bit. You talk about one of the things that popped in my head earlier when you talked about, people, they don't need a lot of money necessarily for the things they want, or they have more than they think. At the same time, we've become, at least in the US, a nation that just borrows excessively. So we need, it's ironic that somehow we can find a way to make payments on everything that we've already bought, but we can't find a way to save, until we do that. So what is enough? How do people decide? And also things happen, and so the lack of a rainy day fund could just kind of take you out, and then you can't recover. So what are some of the baseline financial things that you see that people are not getting right, beyond the obvious of sort of living beyond your means?
Yeah, I mean, I think finances are very knowable, right? And so there's some basic rules that we all know are out there, but a lot of people don't follow, right? So simple stuff like having an emergency fund of 3 to 6 months, just in case something bad happens, having it available.
How many people have that? Like it seems.
Oh, it's much lower than you think. I mean, it's like 10,
I was going to say, not
of
very
people.
much. Yeah.
Right. Comparatively. It's saving 20% of your income. A lot of people in my community, financial independence, will save even a lot more. But, put money away for a rainy day, investing that money, right? So that money is actually working for you, using simple things like index funds, not spending frivolously, right? Being a valuist, spending on things that actually matter to you and not wasting money on things that don't matter to you. And I think a big one, which we never talk about, which is what I talk about in my books, is really putting your money to work towards purpose, identity, and connections. Really, your finances are supposed to be a tool that helps you live a better life, not that you're supposed to spend all your life to make a lot of money and then have no idea what to do with it.
So what does that look like? Give me a tangible example of how someone could do that.
I'll give you an example of how I got it wrong and how I could have done it better.
Okay.
So when I was in medical school, the first thing I did in my first week of medical school is I volunteered on the inpatient hospice at Northwestern University, and I loved it. And then what happened? I eventually went through medical school, realized hospice doctors don't make a lot. It wasn't a lot of, people are not sitting there, bowing at the altar of the hospice doctor. They are of the surgeon or even the general internist who's making these amazing diagnoses and doing these crazy things, right? And so I kind of convinced myself that although I loved hospice work, I needed to do something else. And I eventually did something else and made a lot of money and burnt out because it wasn't fulfilling me. And eventually my career in medicine basically ended in my 40s. Now, if I had taken purpose, identity, and connections, if I had thought about more who I was and what's of value to me, even taken into account my history of losing my father at a young age, I would have probably said, hospice probably fills me up more. And even if I don't make as much money, I'll probably enjoy the work more and I'll probably have a much longer career. And so it might take me longer to get to financial independence, but that won't matter because the point of money is to do the things that fill you up.
Well, it's also enjoying the journey rather than a lot of people are willing to suffer the journey for the destination. And by the way, the destination's never as good as you think it's going to be.
That's the problem. And this is why I talk a lot about the difference between big P purpose and little P purpose. Big P purpose is very goal oriented. And if you're not enjoying the process, you will find that you are not enjoying 95% of the climb there. And then you get there. And when you get there, it's only fun for hours or days or maybe even months.
The most sort of successful people I know and driven people, they will all tell you they got to the top. The view wasn't what they thought they would be. And by all they did was start like going up the next one. Right.
So let me tell you something. All you need to do is look at Elon Musk to realize that our sense of enough is disjointed.
Yeah.
So Elon Musk has more money than anyone else, and he created some of the greatest life-changing things than anyone else. And you know what? He looks completely miserable. So here's the thing. Enough has nothing to do with money. Enough has to do with meaning, which is the stories you tell yourself about yourself. Most people who struggle with enough haven't gotten over their generational and lived trauma of childhood.
Yeah.
And that's where enough comes in. There are great studies.
Right. And particularly if money was short, right. As a kid, or I've seen people go either way with that. Typically they become, lavish overspenders, or they have the money and they count every penny.
But here's the thing. Both of those people haven't figured out enough.
Right.
The lavish spenders think if they just spend more, it's going to deal with that childhood trauma. And the frugal savers think if I just save more and more, it's going to make up for that trauma. And both of them are suffering from the same problem, but they're reacting differently. What they really need to do is go back and tell themselves better stories about their childhood and get over some of that trauma, or they're going to pass it on to their kids. And that's exactly what generational trauma is.
And look, there's always an opportunity. So I remember a story years ago when I was out in Park City for the summer, and I go out in the morning on the deck at the hotel, and I'm talking to this guy. And he's a doctor, and he spends a lot of his time a year in Park City and working remotely. And I said to him, how do you work remotely as a doctor? Like that's a new one for me. And I don't know what it was, whether it was radiology or something else, but he had basically decided that he loved Park City and he lived somewhere else and it wasn't far and he had family and all this stuff. And he basically designed a job where he's the guy that helped, whatever this field was, got the thing, helped you find another person, looked at a second opinion, set it on, coordinated it for you. And he had totally built a job around the life that we want to live. And yes, did he make a little bit less money? Probably. But that story just always stuck with me because people would, if you ask some people, like, there are no jobs as a doctor that let you do that. There's state licensing, whatever. This guy just went and figured it out because that was what was important to him.
It behooves us. We got to get back to winning the game. Winning the game is filling up as much time as you can with things you love and as little time as you can with things you loathe. This guy realized I better change something so I can be in Park City, so I can be a place I love, so I can spend more time doing things that feel purposeful to me.
Right.
And that's what it is. And we're all constantly doing this. Hopefully, if we're healthy throughout our lives, is we're constantly figuring out the calculus of how those numbers work.
So you talk a lot about legacy, which is something we've talked a lot about on this podcast. How do you define legacy and where do people get it right and get it wrong? I'll tell you, there's a quote someone said once. I don't know if it was a story, but I've come to really appreciate about legacy. He said, because it's almost become way too like trite where people are like, it's like this product that people are doing or selling. And he said, look, we don't get to determine our legacy. Like we live our life, how we're going to do it, and other people determine our legacy. And I like that viewpoint. So I'm curious, what's yours? And do you also think this sort of productization of legacy, where people are like, I need to work on my legacy, and they're going around doing horrible things all the time?
So here's what I think. I kind of agree and kind of don't agree with you. I think we have a huge...
That's my favorite part, yeah.
I think we have a huge contribution to our own legacy. When I'm talking about legacy, what I'm saying is how do you affect people, not just today, but in the future? And I think we have a huge impact on that by the things we do and don't do, but much differently than people think. And so I'm a big fan of act locally and think globally. So instead of worrying about what I call big audacious purpose, which is, becoming president, curing cancer, all these things that people are like, that's impact. I say, do the things that fill you up, that you really enjoy, and that's going to create a huge impact and legacy. And I'll give you a perfect example. It's a story from my own life. My maternal grandfather, I never met him. He died in the 1960s. I was born in the 1970s. My maternal grandfather loved math. It was what I would call his little p purpose, the thing that just lit him up.
Yeah.
Because he loved math, he would sit my mom on his lap and he'd have spreadsheets, right? Because this was the 1950s. And he would show her what went in each box and he just loved it. And because he loved it, my mom took notice and she did what kids do is she tried on that identity for herself, the identity of her beloved parent to see if it fit her. And you know what? She loved math. So she became a CPA. Now, when I was a kid, I had the same influence on me. I kind of liked math too. And I saw my mom loving it. I had a learning disability and was literally, I couldn't read and everyone else could. And I think I would have lost complete hope, except I was at the top of the class for math. And I knew if I could do math, that I would be okay in reading. I eventually became a doctor, a highly mathematical field. And one day I was seeing a patient in the hospital and I noticed a mathematical connection between two of his lab results. He was on death's doorstep and we actually made a very rare diagnosis, which was very treatable. But he never came back to the hospital again. And he was a pastor in a local church and took care of runaway kids. And so if you think about this guy, my grandfather, who died in the 1960s, his actions, his love, his purpose is still having an impact 60 years later. And so do we have to go for impact and legacy? No. I suggest you just do the things that are deeply meaningful to you and you will create communities instead of generational trauma where we hand down all the bad things we do and we give that to our kids. I believe in something called generational growth. Be the best you, most excited, most engaged and involved, intentional you, and you will impact the people around you for generations, and it'll matter. And so, yeah, it's not as sexy, it's not as exciting as having someone remember your name 300 years from now, but I think the impact is still there and clear.
Well, to the local stuff too, it's interesting. If you've ever been to, someone, I guess magnanimous isn't the right word, but someone who dies, and I went to one of these funerals and just everyone seems to pour in and thousands of people. It's the person who was like, he only met me once and he said this thing to me, or he made me feel this way, right? It's a lot of these. It's not the, hey, he did this or she did this. It's people come in and just tell these very simple, relatable stories.
And when do you give your best advice? When are you there most for people? It isn't when you're trying to cure cancer.
Yeah.
It's when you're just being your intentional self who's passing on whatever little bit of knowledge you got through doing things you love. And so I think it's really important to hold on to that.
So I think leadership also plays a role in helping to shape both purpose and legacy. How's your experience as both a doctor and a financial advisor shaped your views on leadership? They're very different sort of use cases. And what advice would you also have for leaders trying to balance their personal and professional lives?
And I would say the same thing would go for parenting too.
Yeah.
I think, so how do we teach people? How do we lead people, right? One of the ways is didactically teach them. So we sit them down, we get the whiteboard out and show them how it's done. The other way is by modeling. So we end up doing things the way we think people should do them and show them through our actions what it looks like. And last but not least, it's through experiential learning, right? You give them a task, one that they could fail at but not ruin everything, and you allow them to go out there and do it. And so I think leadership is based on all those things. And again, I think you will be the best leader when you are doing things that feel ultimately purposeful and exciting to you.
Yeah, because that's aligned, right? It's really hard to be asked to go out and be really good at something that you hate and don't want to do with people that you don't want to do it with.
Yeah, and so a lot of the best founders out there don't start as great leaders. They start as people who are deeply, insanely passionate about an idea. The leadership stuff comes afterwards because people follow founders not because they're good leaders. They follow them because they're a moth to the
leaders. Yeah.
Right. But like a moth to the flame.
Visionary.
You see them deeply connected to something that's important to them, and we all want to be a part of that. And especially if we feel some of the same things are important, it attracts us.
So I love the notion that everyone wants progress and no one likes change. And many of our listeners are probably going through major life transitions, whether it's career or personal or navigating new stages of life. I've got a lot of friends sort of moving into the empty nester stage, which is a lot of difference. What advice do you have for those who sort of, feel stuck? I think often good seems to be the enemy of great. I've seen people have a hard time giving up fine or good, even though they know there's something better. When they get fired or it falls apart or they lose the job or then they kind of jump off the track. But oftentimes people have a really hard time, moving off the status quo, even though it's not doing anything for them.
Yeah, I like to remind people that you are who you are, and nothing that happens today or tomorrow is going to change that, right?
Yeah.
So whether you get fired, whether you succeed or you fail, you've always been that person. And so the idea is to be intentional and to act with your values, right? The idea is, regardless of what you're going through, is to be intentionally you. Act out your values and assume that if you act with an intention, that ultimately things will go in the right direction. And so I think people feeling lost right now, it's time to go back to the basics. Who am I? What am I about? What feels purposeful to me? And what kind of intentions can I act with that further that intention and purpose? And we have no control over the people who are going to fire us, the people who are going to accept what we have to give, or the people who are going to turn it down. That's all outside of us. All we can do is be the most authentic and unique self we can be. And so I think that's how you start, especially if you're feeling stuck. So you got to go back to the basics of who am I, what's important to me, and how do I act out that intention and purpose.
And related, then, how do you ensure that you align your financial goals with those values? What steps do you recommend people take to make that alignment? Because that probably, if you looked at the situation, you'd say, well, I'm not leaving because I'm taking this new goal because I'm paid really well, but what am I doing with the money that I'm being paid? Like, it just seems like they've gotten really disconnected from their values, which is freedom and flexibility, for example, and the job has none of that, right? But it pays well.
I think we don't spend enough time thinking about purpose, identity, and connections first. And I think we really have to be very clear on what that means to us. And then we bring our finances in and decide what the trade-offs are. No decision is wrong as long as you're intentional about it. So it is very reasonable to say, I want to be a writer. I love writing. I'm at this place in time right now where I probably can't make money at it, but I make really good money being a doctor. It is very reasonable to say, I'm going to work my ass off as a doctor for 5 years and put off this purpose, identity, and connections. Maybe do a few things for fun that keep me involved in it, but not much. For 5 years until I get to a certain net worth, and then to step away. I don't love that tactic, but it's very reasonable. The other way is to say, you know what? I can go ahead and put my retirement goals on hold and work 75% of the time and make less money, but then use that 25% to start working on being an author today.
And by the way, what is retirement? If you're writing and you enjoy it or you're traveling, then you don't need that hard retirement. Let's go back to the first one. I want to double click on, because I agree that a lot of people making the purposeful decisions have done the hard work or the painful thing, then done the sacrifice. And I think that's all lost a little bit on sort of elements of Gen Z, who want to live the best life from day one, which I appreciate, but also, again, it has trade-offs, right? Particularly if you're coming from certain things. But the problem with I'll just do this for 5 years, right? And particularly in things like law or professional services, well, unless you somehow like put some money on the line that gets like blown up if you hit the 5-year goal, it seems like it's really hard for people. Well, 3 more years and then they turn around and it's been 20.
One more year syndrome.
I know that wasn't your preferred path, but how often can people really set that goal? It's enough, and then they walk away.
So this is where I really talk about memento mori, right? This idea that to bring the, knowledge of death with you while you walk everyday life. We want to win the game. And winning the game doesn't allow you to waste extra years doing things you don't need to monetarily. Does that mean everyone will do it? No. But I think that's the point of our intentions. That's the point of putting purpose first, is we have to be really clear if we're going to front load the sacrifice, what that means, and when we've hit the goals that allow us to really pursue purpose. Because look, my father died at 40. Right? And if he hadn't done things that were deeply enjoyable to him, now lucky enough, my father actually felt very deeply in his heart that he was going to die young. He told my mom that when he married her. So my father spent a lot of time doing things he loved. In fact, he passed up making money. He could have gone and worked in a private practice 10 years earlier, but decided to work at the VA hospital because he liked the work more. He traveled extensively. He loved photography. He had his own dark room in the basement. You don't want to be that person who dies at 40 and never gives yourself the chance to do things you really want to do. Yeah. And so I have no problem with front loading, but you gotta be really intentional about it. And you've got to keep on coming back to purpose comes first before finances.
Make sure front loading doesn't turn into mid loading.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people, what really happens? What really happens is when it gets time to start doing things that are purposeful and exciting, people freak out. It's scary. Right. It is incredibly scary to step off into, I'm going to embark on things that are deeply important to me, yet I could fail. And it's just so much easier to go back to work and make a little more money and tell yourself that extra cushion is going to save you and make things better and allow you to buy extra things. But we have to have the courage to realize that we're given it a limited amount of time in this life. And if you piss it away, it's gone.
What you said there was so parallel to a guest I've had on twice, Philip McKernan, who is sort of this clairvoyant, to be repetitive. He's a clarity coach. He works with people. He's coached people all around the world. And he said, people travel thousands of miles and spend thousands of dollars to go see him for the clarity that they don't want. And when he starts discussing this stuff with people and they start getting really frustrated, he said it's always because they're getting close to their sort of gift, and it's okay to fail at the thing that really doesn't matter. But if you fail at the thing that you always really wanted to do, and I asked him about that, and I was like, well, what he's like, you can't really fail at the thing you've always wanted to do.
So
like,
here's the thing.
Yeah.
Let me tell you a story, and that I have in my first book, Taking Stock. There's this guy I took care of named Ernesto. And of course, it's a fake name. Details have been changed so that I don't divulge things with the person. But his name was Ernesto, and he had a dream of climbing Mount Everest. And so in his 20s, he took a year off to train and go climb Mount Everest. And everyone thought he was crazy. He was in the middle of his corporate career. He was moving up. He was being fast-tracked. And he put that all aside to do this in his 20s. He went there. They got to base camp. They climbed about halfway. The weather changed. It became impassable. He had to come back down. By then, his time was over. He went back to work. I met him in his 40s when he was dying of leukemia, and all he wanted to do was talk about climbing on Mount Everest. And it wasn't bitter, and it wasn't unhappy. Yeah. He wanted to tell everyone what it felt like and how invigorating it was. He didn't care that he didn't succeed. The fact is, he had the courage to do the difficult thing that was deeply important to him. And on his deathbed, he knew that that would not be a regret. It's not whether you succeed or fail. It's whether you have the courage to try. And I love the In the Arena speech for just that. Like, you want to be in the arena bloodied and barely lifting your head up. Yeah. That's living. It's not standing up the victor. It's when you're in the midst of it and it's hard and it's deep and it's important. And that's a gift. And I hope for all of my people that I take care of in hospice, that when they're on their deathbeds, they can remember that valiant fight and know they fought it.
That's still one of the greatest speeches of all time. Maybe we'll link to it in the podcast. All right. Well, Jordan, last question for you that I always like to ask, and this is multivariant. It can be personal and professional or single or repeated, but what's a mistake that you've made that you've learned the most from?
I think my biggest mistake is that I kept on not listening and putting off the things that were utterly important to me. Like, I knew I always wanted to be a writer. I knew I wanted to be a public speaker. It turned into things like podcasting and blogging, but I kept putting them off. I kept on telling myself, that's not what you do. Like, you be a doctor. Scary, that's something you do. And I just feel thankful that my life trajectory eventually forced me to do this before, God forbid, like I didn't die like my father did when he was 40. That I got to this place where I gave myself permission because I could look at my finances and say, okay, I'm safe. Yeah. That was the thing that gave me the permission. I really wish I'd given myself permission way before then.
All right. Well, Jordan, where can people learn about you and your work?
The easiest way is to go to jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET.com. There you can find links to both of my books, as well as all the places I create content. The place I do it mostly is at the Earn and Invest podcast, earnandinvest.com, or just go to jordangrumet.com.
All right, Jordan, thanks for joining us today. I'm fascinated by your personal story and how you've turned your own experience into a purpose that will impact others.
Thank you so much for having me.
To our listeners, thanks for tuning into the podcast today. We'll include links to Dr. G and his work on the detailed episode page at robertglazer.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd really appreciate if you could take just a few minutes and leave us a review, as that's what helps new users discover the show and hear from amazing guests such as Dr. G. If you're listening to Apple Podcasts, just select the library icon, click on Elevate, scroll down to the bottom, and you can leave a very quick rating or review. Thanks again for your support. Until next time, keep elevating.